Now, in my last class, I was discussing the contribution of Elfric we had done, and then I passed on to King Alfred. As you can see that in three ways King Alfred had contributed. Contributed towards the development of Anglo-Saxon prose, as you have seen. Firstly, by developing the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which we will be doing today, and by translations of the important Latin texts during those times, and by himself writing and translating some texts himself. So though he was extremely busy as a king, he was busy with fighting, as you have seen, fighting with the Danes. Actually, he took time out to do these literary works. So let us go to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Before King Alfred, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was nothing but a loose and detached record of the birth of certain kings and the history of their warfare. So it was a very dry account. But due to the sincere efforts and spontaneous enthusiasm of King Alfred, then the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle became a monumental work of Old English prose. So King Alfred had contributed some portions of the Chronicle, but most of these works actually they were translated, they were done by other writers. Now the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a collection of annals, means documents, histories actually, in Old English, narrating the history of the Anglo-Saxons. The annals were created later in the 9th century, probably in Wessex, during the reign of Alfred the Great. Multiple manuscript copies were made and distributed to monasteries across England and were independently updated. In one case, the Chronicle was still being actively updated in 1154. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle actually has a very long history. It started in 60 AD, and it even in the year 1154 AD it was continuing. So it was going on through quite a long time. And there were actually, we'll move on to this, 9 manuscripts are there that have survived in whole or in part, though not all are of equal historical value, and not one of them is the original version. The oldest seems to have been begun towards the end of Alfred's reign, while the most recent was written in Petersboro Abbey after a fire at the monastery there in 1116. Almost all of the material in the Chronicle is in the form of annals by year. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is kept through years. So one year is mentioned, and against that certain events which took place in that year is put down there. So the earliest is dated to 60 and 60 AD actually, and historical material follows up to the year in which the Chronicle was written, at which point contemporary records begin. These manuscripts collectively are known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So this is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It is not unbiased, that is, the people who had copied it or written it, they were somewhat partisan. There are occasions when comparison with other medieval sources makes it clear that the scribes who wrote it omitted events or told one-sided versions of stories, and there are also places where the different versions contradict with each other. So it was some kind of partiality in the writings can be noted. However, taken as a whole, the Chronicle is the single most important historical source for the period between the departure of the Romans and the Norman conquest. So actually it started after the Romans had left Great Britain and before the Norman conquest took place in 1066. So it was quite a long history. Even after, as you saw, it was continued to 1154. Much of the information given in the Chronicle is not recorded elsewhere. In addition, the manuscripts are important sources for the history of the English language. In particular, the later Petersboro text, is one of the earliest examples of Middle English in existence. So, as we saw, there are 9 manuscripts and surviving manuscripts. Now, as we saw, it is not a single document, a series of related texts. So, one text follows another. All surviving manuscripts are copies, so it is not known for certain where or when the first version of the Chronicle was composed. So, what has survived now, actually, those are the copies only, not the sort of, as we can see, not the original versions. They are only copies. And so it is difficult to understand when the first version was written. It is generally agreed that the original version was written in the late 9th century, probably in the early 890s, by a scribe in Wessex. So this is the general belief. After the original Chronicle was compiled, copies were made and distributed to various monasteries. We have already seen that. Additional copies were made for further distribution or to replace lost manuscripts, and some copies were updated independently of each other. And some of these later copies are those that have survived. So all these copies were constantly being made because some were lost, some were destroyed. So to replace them, new copies were made. The earliest extant manuscript, the Winchester Chronicle, was written by a single scribe up to the year 891. Scribe wrote the year number 692 in the margin of the next line. So this is in Roman numerals. Subsequent material was written by other scribes. This appears to place the composition of the Chronicle at no later than 892. Further evidence is provided by Bishop Asser's use of a version of the Chronicle in his work Life of King Alfred, known to have been composed in 893. So these are all historical evidence as to when the Chronicle may have been written. It is known that the Winchester manuscript is at least 2 removes from the original of the Chronicle. So 2 removes meaning that 2 copies were made from the original manuscript. As a result, there is no proof that the Chronicle was compiled at Winchester. So it might have been written at some other place, and it might have been then brought to Winchester. It is also difficult to fix the date of composition, but it is generally thought that the Chronicles were composed during the reign of Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great, as you know, he ascended the throne in 871 and ruled till 899. So during his tenure as the king, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was sort of, as you can see, it was developed. Alfred deliberately tried to revive learning and culture during his reign and encouraged the use of English as a written language. So it was Alfred's purpose, which we have, which we saw in his preface to this Cura Pastoralis, which we saw how he had the hope of reviving learning, which had fallen into kind of, as you know, the people were no longer knowledgeable enough. They did not know Latin. They did not try to study. So Alfred was trying to revive learning. The chronicle itself, as well as the distribution of copies to other centers of learning, may be a consequence of the changes Alfred introduced. So there were different monasteries in England during this time, and many copies of this Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the different manuscripts were made and they were distributed to different monasteries. And this was generally undertaken by King Alfred, as we saw. Let us move on. So we have seen this, the 9 surviving manuscripts, of which 8 are written entirely in Old English, Anglo-Saxon that is, while the 9th is in Old English with a translation of each annal into Latin. The Petersboro Chronicle, this is one of the main chronicles, contains early Middle English as well. So it is the Middle English version is also there. The oldest is Corpus Christi manuscript. MS stands for manuscript 173. Is known as the Winchester Chronicle or the Parker Chronicle. It is named after Matthew Parker, an Archbishop of Canterbury, who once owned it. So it's also called the Parker Chronicle after this individual who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He held a religious post. 6 of the manuscripts were printed in an 1861 edition by B. Thorpe, with the text laid out in columns labeled A through F. So the letters A to F were used to number them. This nomenclature, this naming, that is, nomenclature means the way of naming something, is widely used and is given below. Following this convention, so these further manuscripts are often called GHI. So from F, then again this proceeds to the next alphabets, GHI. So like this, the chronicles are being given the names. The A chronicle, the B, like this. So the texts that were copied. Most of the versions were done under Alfred's supervision in the 9th century. So it was King Alfred, of course, who was primarily responsible for the revival and the sort of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle being revived. The great authors, some of the great authors, included Elfric. We have heard of Elfric. Ulfstan we'll be reading about later. Plegmund, he was Alfred's archbishop, and Alfred himself also contributed to the writing. Alfred had 4 scholars who helped him in the translation. So Alfred took the help of scholars, as we know. The entries before Alfred are terse and very factual. So before King Alfred took over the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he tried to give it more sort of vigor. Prior to his taking up the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it was the anecdotes, the annals were quite brief. And there is no attempt to embellish or decorate, no kind of decoration, no effort at decoration is there. So the bare facts are written down. So the objective before Alfred was merely to record. So people who had written down, who had recorded these events, they were only trying to put down some of the important events in the history of England. They did not try to make it appear to the readers as interesting documents. They were not concerned with that, so that it would make for interesting reading. They were just jotting down some of the events which had happened to them, some of the events which appeared important were perhaps trivial ones, but nonetheless they jotted down those events. Alfred made the history more interesting. So Alfred sort of gave this a more interesting flavor. During the years 893 to 899, there are stirring accounts of the struggles between Alfred and the Danes. So as you know, that the Danes were a constant threat to Alfred's kingdom, and they had a number of fights with King Alfred. And I had mentioned the Treaty of Wedmore, which was concluded by King Alfred with them, and after that some kind of peace returned to England, and King Alfred was able to concentrate on his sort of this mission of educating the masses, his subjects. So during these years 893 to 899, we read about these fights, the accounts of these fights with the Danes, Alfred's battle against the Danes. The king's voice constantly interrupts the narrative. So the king is trying to, of course, exhort his people. He is talking, and his voice can be heard throughout this narrative. It can be heard throughout this narrative, and as a king, when he was making these entries, he obviously is praising the bravery and sacrifice of his people, of his army, and obviously in the struggle against the Danes, it was important that England could achieve some kind of peace. Otherwise, it would not have been possible for Alfred to sort of, do any kind of educational work, undertake anything at all. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle continued after Alfred, as we know. Once again, there is a falling off in the narrative power after Alfred's death. Again, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it does not really, it could not maintain the kind of quality that was there during Alfred's time. So it fell off. It really lost its flavor. It lost its vigor, and the interesting anecdotes were again supplanted by dull accounts. Now we will just have some examples, just one or two examples, three most important events in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle we might mention here. Under the year 1004 AD, there is the conflict between the Danes and the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready. So here in 1004 AD, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we can read about the conflict between the Danes and this Anglo-Saxon king, who had a very curious kind of a epithet, the Unready. So this account is given. Under 1066, as you all know that this is a very important year in the history of English literature. There is the Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror, who was the Duke of Normandy, he of course defeated Harold, who was the last Anglo-Saxon king, and then the Norman conquest started, and influence of the French influence came in. Now we have in philology we have read about the Latin influence. I'd be doing with you the French influence, and I'd give you some kind of a background to the French influence on the English language, and you will again have a reference to William the Conqueror. He was the Duke of Normandy, a province in France. So we'll be reading about him or talking about him when we do the French influence in philology. So this event, the Norman conquest, is also mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So this is also a very important event. Next, lastly, we can have a look at this date, 1086 AD, and there is a full-length portrait. There is a full-length portrait of or character sketch of King William I. So, for the first time, we see that kind of a description or a character sketch of an individual, in this case a royal individual, that is King William I, is provided in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So thus history becomes the universal biography of great men. So all these events involving kings and leaders are put down. They are recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The contrast, that is the difference between the vigorous and absorbing entries during Alfred's time and those that precede or follow, is very striking. So that is something that we can notice quite easily, because the entries before King Alfred were they just mentioned that someone was born on this date, or someone became king on this date, in this year, or someone died in this year. Just this little bit of information. But when Alfred took over, of course, he sort of did not stop at just recording these events, but he tried to make it more interesting to the readers. And that is the contribution of King Alfred. In spite of being a king, he had a literary mind, so that's quite remarkable. And he had to take the help of the scribes, the scholars, of course, because they did not know the Latin and all that. Still, so the importance of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lies in the fact that it is the prime source. It is the book for the histories of the period and for the Middle English scholars as well. So therein lies the importance of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So when we would be talking about King Alfred's contribution to the development of Anglo-Saxon prose, obviously you will have to mention his translation, the translations that he had undertaken himself. Some of the texts he had translated himself, and the texts that he had chosen, 5 in number, as we had discussed in our last class. And then you have to mention the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and together you can assess his contribution, King Alfred's contribution to the development of Anglo-Saxon prose. So we finished Alfred. Now let us move on to the last person, who is another very important individual in this history of Anglo-Saxon prose, the development that is, and he is Wulfstan the bishop. Now, as we saw, Anglo-Saxon prose had its solid basic, that is, a kind of a base was prepared under the pioneering achievement of the great English king, King Alfred. It had further development and received an artistic growth. At the hand of Alfred, we have also seen that he is regarded as a great artist, and some people regard him as the greatest Anglo-Saxon prose writer. But Alfred, of course, is followed by another prose writer, and he is Wulfstan. He is less of a finished artist than Alfred, but the popular emphasis of his language gives it rich color and lively tones. So he was a very popular writer, and he aimed at addressing the English people. Wulfstan, like Alfred, was an artist, and he added to the growth of the forceful, impulsive English prose style. So the English prose style developed a new kind of flavor and color during his time. So who was Wulfstan? He was the Archbishop of York from 1002 to 1023, and he was a preacher. So he was a religious preacher. So that's his primary kind of how we should look at him. The most remarkable of his homilies, he wrote a number of homilies. They date from 1012, the time when the English were suffering the ills of the Danish invasion. So during Alfred's time, you saw how the Danes were attacking England. After Alfred's death, they again started to come and tried to conquer the country, and ultimately they somehow they regained kind of supremacy in some parts of England. With deep feeling, the homilist, that is a writer of homilies, deplores the irreligion and immorality of his people, to which he attributes their misfortunes, and he proclaims the near advent of the great chastiser, the Antichrist. So this was a Christian belief that the Antichrist, who would be someone who would not be so kind-hearted and who would not be so concerned about human beings, the redemption of human beings as Christ had been, but he would be the Antichrist. So it would be quite different from Christ, that he would be coming and he would be chastising, he would be punishing the English people. So Wulfstan wrote about all these things. He tried to instill in the hearts of his fellow men kind of a fear of the Antichrist, so that they should not lead vicious lives. He is less of a finished artist than Alfred, but the popular emphasis of his language gives it rich color and lively tones. After Wulfstan, everything was over. Antichrist in the form of the Danes came, and they became the masters of the country for a short period of time, until of course William the Conqueror would come and the Norman conquest would take place. They were brought under the Norman yoke, we know that. So Anglo-Saxon prose would have taken shape. It was modeling itself on Latin, with the exception of part of its vocabulary would have become much what it was when in the 14th century it regained a place in literature. So a kind of forceful, impulsive prose style was added by Wulfstan. His main work, which we would be referring to in the next some of the slides, it was in the form of a letter. It was written in the form of a letter. It was addressed to the English, and it is acclaimed still now as a remarkable specimen of Anglo-Saxon prose. So this reveals his patriotic zeal, his love for his country, and his impulsive mode of writing. He was very emotional. So letter is a kind of a emotional, passionate one, a patriotic exhortation. He's asking them to rouse themselves and to stand against the Danes. And apart from these letters to the English people, another remarkable work is the Homilies, which contains, like Alfred, rich instructive sermons. Sermons meaning didactic, moralizing, kind of aiming to teach something. And it sort of has the quality of an impressive quality, which could have an effect on the people. So this slide, of course, is quite the same thing. So he was a Christian as well as a patriot, and these are instructive sermons. And as you see, they are given out in a telling manner, which easily impresses, convinces the audience. Now, Wulfstan wrote some works in Latin, and there are numerous works in Old English, which was a vernacular language at that time. So Wulfstan has quite a number of works to his credit. He wrote certain works in Latin, which was the language of the scholars, as you know, in those times. And he was the archbishop. He was a religious personality. a churchman, so obviously he had a very good control over the Latin language, but he also wrote in Old English. Now, his best known homily is Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, or it is translated into English as Sermon of the Wolf to the English. Now, Sermo actually means sermon. Lupus is actually wolf in Latin. Anglos, ad means two. So, Anglos, as you can well understand, English people. So, Sermon of the Wolf to the English. So, his name was Ulfstan, so he refers to himself as, in short, as Wolf, like that. So, this is the most famous work written by Ulfstan. In it, he proclaims the depredations of the Danes, the exploits of the Danes, how they were destroying everything. They were essentially plunderers. They came and they plundered the land and they went back. For a short period of time there was respite, but again they came back. So it happened again and again. And the English were quite powerless after King Alfred. They could not sort of hold their own against the Danes. He calls upon the English to repent of their sinful ways and return to the faith of baptism, where there is protection from the fires of hell. So here you will see he is trying to instill fear in the hearts of his countrymen. He is asking them to repent of their sinful ways. So they have fallen into sinful ways, and he asks them not to go into such sins, but try to be more pious and religious minded. So that was his aim, to bring them back from the path of sin. Otherwise they would be, of course, they would be thrown into the fires of hell. So that was one of the important concepts of hell, that the fires of hell would engulf someone if he or she did not choose the virtuous path. And this was also in the medieval age, this was quite common. Now, he also wrote many homilies relating to the last days. So, the last days in Christian theology, the last days, it is called the doomsday, DOOMSDAAY, when the Antichrist would be coming. So, Christ would be coming back to judge people. So, but he would not come in the original shape or appearance. He would come in the form of Antichrist, who would be a very kind of hard taskmaster, and he would punish all those who had sort of not followed the path of virtue. So the age of the Antichrist was a popular theme in Ulfstan's homilies, which also includes the issues of death and the last judgment, the judgment day, or the doomsday as it was called. So Ulfstan was in a very vehement and very forceful way, you might say. He was trying to force, or he was trying to make his countrymen listen to his words. Otherwise, he knew that they would not listen to him if he did not put his argument in this way. So, this is the contribution of Ulfstan. How he was writing during this last period before the advent of the Danes. When the advent, of course, the Danes were there and they had conquered the country under King Canute, Canute, for a short period of time. The Danish rule prevailed, and then William of Normandy took over. So these are the individual contributions: Alfred, Elfric, Ulfstan, now and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of course. Regarding the development of Anglo-Saxon prose, there are certain other proverbs, Old English proverbs. Of course, they also are included in the field of Anglo-Saxon prose. So I'll just mention them in short. And the source is a writer, a Roman writer called Marcus Porcius Cato, Marcus, Porcius, Portius, Cato, Cato. So he was a Roman soldier, an orator, and a writer, also a social reformer. So he lived from 234 to 149 BC, before the birth of Christ. And his most famous work is Origins, Origines, Origins. And what is this about? It is a description of the history of the Italian cities, and it is one of the first historical books in Latin. So of course he was a Roman writer, he wrote in Latin, and as an orator he sprinkled his speeches with maxims or proverbs, যেগুলোকে প্রবাদ বলা হয় বাংলায়. So short sentences, short, very striking sentences which have some inner meaning, অন্তর্নিহিত একটা অর্থ আছে যেগুলোর আর কি. So he had this style of writing. Now some of these proverbs were translated into Anglo-Saxon, and they form the gamut of Anglo-Saxon prose. Some of the proverbs deal with man and society, with human beings and society, and some are concerned with the Jewish nation, about Moses. As you know, he was the leader of the Jews, Moses, and some are events that are described in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, as you know, is the earlier part of the Bible. The Bible has two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and the Old Testament is the earlier part, the first part. So this book actually is described as one of the keynotes of the Old Testament, the Book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy. So this has been translated, and the Jewish faith and worship and daily conduct is sort of talked about here. So with this, the reference to this writer Cato, we come to the end of our discussion of Anglo-Saxon prose, and so I think you have understood what I was trying to tell you, and so as I told you, you will have to just talk about these three individuals, Alfred, Elfric, and Ulster, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and finally a little bit you might exclude also. There's no harm in excluding these proverbs, so that's not very important. So I'll stop sharing this screen now.